Julie is originally from Canada, and she is now active at the University of Sheffield. She has a title, Reader in Modern History. Reader is an academic title that actually is used.
I do more than read.
Yeah, it's used in the Great Britain and some Commonwealth states, and it's ranked between associate professor and full professor, depends on the country. She actually did her PhD at the Cambridge University. She lectured at the universities in Manchester and Bristol. And now, since 2003, she's employed at the University of Sheffield. She's been, she was a visiting professor at Paris Diderot University, guest professor at ELTE University in Budapest, visiting professor at the University of Toulouse. And she's engaged with 20th century British political history mostly, but she also pays a lot of attention to women's and gender history. Her work is also connected to the history of race and ethnicity, British fascism, and other forms of political extremism. And one of her most recent monographs is Guilty Women, Foreign Policy and Appeasement in Interwar Britain, which was published several years ago. And I will stop here. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the generous introduction. Thank you so much for inviting me, especially Dagmar, who made it all happen, and of course Marta and all the team. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here and to be part of this discussion. It's also appropriate that I'm in the graveyard shift, given the topic of my, the focus of my talk today and the way I'm weaving together various aspects of my research over these years. I just have a small technical question. If I'm standing here, how do I click? There we go. That's why I push this there. Okay. Let's see. Yes, it does. All right, brilliant. Thank you. All right, so what happened in Britain after the vote was won? How did those who had been at the vanguard of the movement respond in 1918 and in the immediate period after the Representation of the People Act, an act that provided partial women's suffrage? Of course, we've already heard how that played out. With so much emphasis in the historiography, and now during the centenary year in Britain on the sensational suffragettes, too little attention, I think, has been paid to the moments of anticlimax and to the messier narrative of suffrage afterlives. After providing a more general introduction and setting the scene, I'll offer an illuminating biographical case study of Dame Helena Swannack and her political career, her life story, as well as the story of her death. And I think because this is illustrative of the transitions and transformations in women's political lives, their status, and their personal internalization of political crisis in Britain after 1918. Swannack was a suffragist, not a suffragette. She was a pacifist, she was an anti-war activist, she was a pioneer in the field of international relations, which was particularly remarkable for a woman. She was a substitute delegate to the League of Nations, and by the late 1930s, increasingly, she was an apologist for Hitler, insofar as she supported a position of peace at any price. Further, she committed suicide in November 1939, and it was clear that this fateful decision was motivated by the recurrence of World War. I want to focus on her story as a prism for women's political activism in the national and the international spheres, and as a vivid example of a post-war, post-suffrage contribution. Although she was an active and outspoken suffragist, this was only the beginning of her career, whereas too often the suffrage movement is seen as the climax of a political career. It will be useful, I think, to use biography to engage with many of the core questions being explored in this workshop, especially about democratization, peace building, the parameters of women's citizenship, and an added element, and that's how biography, and in this case, a grave to the cradle rather than a cradle to the grave approach, because of course, I think we see Swannack's life very differently because of the method and circumstances around her death. I think these will illustrate, as I say, essential aspects of these gendered post-war transitions. All right, so we've come here to this workshop on women and post-war transitions to evaluate the impact of women's suffrage and citizenship comparatively and by setting different national case studies next to each other. We are all in one way or another thinking about what happens after the vote is won, of course, in the cases where that was achieved. We're also thinking about, therefore, the nature of citizenship, both in terms of status and practice, and it will be useful to evoke Rose and Canning's definition that citizenship should be understood as a political status assigned to individuals by states, as a relation of belonging to specific communities, and as a set of practices that define the relationships between peoples and states and among peoples within communities. Now, in the British case, the study of women in politics went in many ways into abeyance in the last 2 decades or so of the 20th century, only to be reinvigorated and with a much more sophisticated conceptualization at the beginning of the 21st century. Now, I cite here the contribution and the kickstart offered by the historian Susan Pedersen. In 2000, she wrote a short article in the magazine Perspectives, where she noted the paucity of work on women in politics in British history, noting that politics had somehow dropped out of gender history. And in its place, there was this cultural analysis that offered thick description, as she put it, but that sidestepped causal analysis and the study of change and a political sense. Now, since Pedersen's provocative thoughts on this issue in her article, which was called The Future of Feminist History, I think it's precisely this approach that has really burgeoned. At the same time, interest in interworld politics and the application of new methodologies and theoretical perspectives have advanced the debates and moved us on considerably from empirically driven high politics. So, to offer a larger kind of sense of what's happened here, modern British political history, I think, has been desegregated in gender terms. And it's a lot more than a coincidence that this has occurred in anticipation of the centenary of women's partial enfranchisement this year. All right, so there was a momentous sense of achievement, of course, when the Representation of the People Act was passed on the 6th of February, 1918. And when all men over the age of 21 and most women over the age of 30 were able to vote for the first time in December 1918. Now, of this entirely new element that was introduced by the Act, that was the naval and military voter and the woman voter, the latter stimulated excitement and anticipation, as well as a lot of anxiety. It was reported that while there had never been such an outwardly tame general election, as the one held on the 14th of December, 1918, there was one section of electors to whom, however externally calm, the election must have brought a thrill. The women are said to have voted in crowds, in some London constituencies greatly outnumbering the men. The experience was not, quote, only novel, but it was momentous. It was of revolutionary proportion, as women should be the helpmate in our political home. Now, this excitement was dampened by frustration on the part of those still excluded from the franchise, of course, and Mary MacArthur pointed to the paradox where, as she put it, the vote was conceded to women on the grounds of their service in the war, yet the Act excluded the vast majority of women war workers. Gottlieb has encouraged us to revisit that whole question of the granting of the franchise, arguing that what happens is that the basis of citizenship shifts during the war period from gender to patriotism. This does not, however, diminish the symbolic importance of the achievement of the suffrage for women. For Lady Londonderry, by 1918, she put it, the franchise had been granted to women chiefly in recognition of their service to the state during the war. What a change has taken place in the position of women in politics since those days, she wrote in 1938. So very clearly, enfranchisement opened the floodgates to women's entry into public life. So how revolutionary was women's suffrage in the British context? Martin Pugh has noted the gradualist and evolutionary nature of suffrage reform in British society, of course. Aside from annual parliaments, all the objectives of the Chartists from the mid-19th century were met by 1918. The Chartist movement serving as a reminder that an abrupt organizational decline cannot be taken as an adequate indication of failure, but merely represented as a stage in the evolution of a movement. So what this suggests is then that women, men, and politicians, and the press, of course, may have expected revolutionary change with the advent of suffrage, but in keeping with British political traditions, this was much more evolutionary and long drawn out. So in this first flush of excitement after the motion was passed that women could also stand as MPs, this was legislation from October 1918, 17 women did so in the 1918 general election. They only, though, had a couple of weeks, or a few weeks, in fact, to prepare their campaigns, and I think this is fundamental. So in many ways, this was going to be a false start for women on the starting line of parliamentary politics, as only one was elected, but she didn't take her seat, as she was the Sinn Féin candidate, the Countess Markovic, and she was in prison at the time as well, which prevented her even further from taking her seat. She wouldn't have in any case because she represented Sinn Féin. Of the others, only Christabel Pankhurst and Mary MacArthur had any real prospect of success. It's also significant that among this pioneer group, not one was ever elected as an MP. However, saying this implies that this post-war, this post-suffrage story is depressing, it's downbeat. It's a succession of defeats and disappointments. The promise of suffrage was not only celebrated by the minority of the population who were actively political and joined political parties. And in fact, I think we see something much more positive. Pat Thane has noted women's eagerness to exercise their franchise, for instance, in the next election in 1922. The Times commented in 1922 that the greatest surprise which those in charge of polling booths had yesterday was the number of women who appeared to vote immediately after the booths were opened. Canvassers found themselves questioned alertly and adroitly on matters not usually considered women's questions. Foreign policy was a strong point moving women in constituencies. So there's a lot of convincing evidence that the novelty of the franchise certainly encouraged political engagement. And it's clear from a content analysis of a number of newspapers from the time that there was nothing short of a fascination with and a developing really celebrity culture around women exercising their rights and scoring many firsts, as they were called. First women to do this, first women to do that in public life. Now, so much of the scholarship, I think, has adopted this tone of disappointment and grappled with kind of decline and a schism of the feminist movement after suffrage. And it's led to, I think, a distortion of the picture. In fact, the status and a success of interwar feminism in Britain has been hotly debated since the 1920s, in fact, not just in the historiography. The anticlimax of suffrage was expressed by some with some subtlety. Sorry, I was meant to show you the picture about women voting for the first time. But as I say, the anticlimax is expressed by Virginia Woolf in A Room of One's Own, which incidentally was published in 1928, the year of the equal franchise. And she refers very much to the impact, or more rightly to the lack of impact, of the 1918 legislation. As she put it, my aunt, this of course is her alter ego, it's not actually Virginia Woolf, but my aunt, Mary Beaton, I must tell you, died by a fall from her horse when she was out riding to take the air in Bombay. The news of my legacy reached me on one night about the same time that the act was passed that gave votes to women. A solicitor's letter fell into the postbox, and when I opened it, I found that she had left me £500 a year forever. Of the two, the vote and the money, the latter seemed infinitely the more important. Now, we're going to hear this ambivalence many times, and it was widespread. And it only deepened in the 1930s and against the backdrop of economic and political crisis. Bringing their thoughts together on a number of different themes, the contributors to a book called Our Freedom and Its Results, published in 1936, said that they could reach no positive conclusion, and all they could agree on was that it was too soon to judge what it all amounts to. None of them feel the freedom of women in society is either really achieved or really stable, or that there's any clear evidence as to what the result of it will be when the time comes. Now, in past decades, we've seen the important correctives to the view that feminism failed between the wars. And more nuanced interpretations have emerged, of course, of the undeniable dispersal of the movement into so many different feminist pressure groups. Again, Pat Thane has argued that the proliferation of women's organizations was not a splintering of the women's movement. Rather, it illustrates how women's organizations came to permeate public life in the decades after the vote was gained, while continuing to cooperate in key issues. So what we see, I think, and what I find the most convincing, is that it's not that feminism is sidelined, but in many ways that it is mainstreamed, that it's de-radicalized with every small but significant success. There was, of course, a backlash against women and feminism in Britain in this period, and I can give you many examples of this. A kind of fear of women, a deep misogyny as well. So I don't want to deny that in any way. But I think that does militate against this much more kind of convincing story, this positive story about the mainstreaming of feminist advances. All right, so given some backlash, but given these successes, where do we situate the women who became MPs between the wars? Now, their number was small, but they were nonetheless a much discussed group, those who had realized their full citizenship rights. Women were MPs, first of all. This was, I think, mentioned also in the previous presentation. Women MPs were definitely expected to represent all women by dint of their sex. Just as women were presumed to be a block of voters because they were presumed to share the same interests about home, health, and shopping. But many cohorts of women disproved these allegations during the interwar years, and women MPs themselves recognized the pressure that they were under. As early as 1927, as part of a deputation to cabinet, Nancy Astor, who was the first female MP to take her seat, she identified a blame game at work. As she put it, we have always realized that true democracy will have to depend upon men and women, and we realize that when trouble comes, the women get the hard end of the stick. Looking into this business of women MPs in 1935, one reporter asked himself, what would the old suffragettes have thought about it all? His answer was rife with examples of the trivial questions that women MPs seemed to ask in Parliament, and he was struck by their interest in foreign rather than in domestic affairs, funnily enough, concluding that the spirit of 1913 is very hard to trace in Westminster these days. But in many ways, women MPs were given their due, and of course their impact was far beyond their numbers. There were, in the mid-1930s, there were 9 women in Parliament. Nonetheless, they had a great deal of attention, and they were spearheaded a number of important campaigns. Indeed, one of the surprising presence of women was in foreign policy debate in the 1930s, when the Duchess of Atholl, Eleanor Rathbone, Edith Summerskill, and Ellen Wilkinson, most prominently, were relentless critics of Chamberlain's foreign policy. On the flip side, women voters and many of the most prominent women in public life were identified as and identified themselves as a peace bloc. Among both their champions and detractors, I think we find surprisingly a fair number of women, and it was the mood of the years for feminists, including those who fought in the vanguard of the suffrage movement, to feel let down by the patriarchal state, yes, but also to feel let down by their sisters. So there's a real sense of betrayal amongst women too. And we're going to see some of this in the case of Helena Swannack. Now, there were a number of issues here. There are a number of issues, I think, that have been raised so far about periodization, about commemoration, and about the ways that anniversaries have been constructed, constricted, and distorted in trying to narrate this story of women's emancipation in Britain. So now, at the end, or nearing the end of the centenary year, I've worked hard to insert and highlight the post-suffrage chapter in the story. With the public and with the media, this is sometimes a really Sisyphusian task, as the appetite is mainly for a menu of kind of suffragette outrages and militant heroic deeds. Now, the unveiling of the statue of suffragist of suffragist leader Millicent Garrett Fawcett in April this year, I think has worked to some extent, but not entirely, to counteract that kind of fixation on the suffragettes. Fawcett was the leader of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, the NUWSS, and her life maps the modern suffrage movement. She was amongst the first to gather signatures for the petition organized by John Stuart Mill in 1866, and she was also there in 1928 to see the passage of equal franchise. She died the next year in 1929. So I got the once-in-a-lifetime and unexpected privilege and opportunity to work with the artist Gillian Waring, not in determining who should be atop the plinth, because Millicent Fawcett was already the choice, but to help the artist determine the 59 other figures, some men, but mainly women, who were going to be represented alongside Fawcett. All right, so I think this is a good segue then to the biographical case study of Helena Swannack. My interest in Helena Swannack relates to suffrage afterlives and to the political diaspora, if you like, from the Edwardian suffrage movement. She was a leading suffragist, pacifist, internationalist, substitute delegate to the League of Nations in 1924 and to the 10th Assembly in 1929. She was a journalist and a pioneering international relations scholar. And in that way, she provides an excellent case study of a suffragist whose post-suffrage career was as vibrant, as engaged, as active and committed, and as controversial as anything she did during her so-called suffrage days. Born in Bavaria before the family moved to Britain when she was 4 years old, she was educated at Notting Hill High School and at Girton College, Cambridge. From 1888 to 1909, she was engaged in social work in Manchester and was a frequent contributor to newspapers. But it was the non-violent but democratic suffrage movement that defined Swannack's political outlook, and she was the first editor of Common Cause, which was the NUWSS's publication. And the name, of course, was significant. Just as some militants maintained their militancy into the post-suffrage era, so for Swannack, it was the rejection of violence as a method that defined her outlook and determined the causes that preoccupied her. As a mourner wrote in one of the obituaries, it's here, the outstanding quality of Mrs. Swannack's mind lay in a calm, logical judgment and an unwavering dislike of the unregulated emotional fervor which leads often to destructive violence. Because of this, she strongly opposed the Pankhurst militancy in demanding votes for women. Equally because of this, she knew that war between nations, even as the avowed instrument of collective security, could be nothing but an inane and tragic futility. Swannack attended the June 1913 International Suffrage Congress in Budapest. She was meant to go to the Congress of Women at The Hague in 1915, but at the last minute she couldn't go due to ill health. She earned the esteem also of leading men, and she worked closely with E.D. Morrell, with Lord Allen of Hertford, and with Ramsay MacDonald in the Union of Democratic Control during the First World War. Swannack, therefore, was well regarded and well connected, evidenced by her appointment as a delegate to the League of Nations. Yet she was also an early sufferer of what we might recognize as imposter syndrome. And when she was invited to go as a substitute delegate to the Fifth Assembly of the League in 1924, she said she was ashamed to say, and here it is, that my first feeling was fear. I thought myself too inexperienced. I knew that I had quite enough experience of public speaking and committee work. I was conscious that I had studied parts of the European situation, and in particular the constitution and techniques of the League of Nations, at least as much as any of the non-technical members of the delegation. But I was intimidated by the notion of having to find my feet among diplomats and officials of all sorts. We can't really imagine many men admitting to the same sense of debility, I think. Now, she was also a leading light, of course, in the feminist pacifist movement. She was the first president of the British section of the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom, the British section going by the WIL. It's interesting to trace her parting of ways with the WIL in the 1930s, and her sense that the organization was not absolute enough in its pacifism. Although separated by a generation, her friendship with Vera Brittain seems to have strengthened at around about the same time, and she was very much in sync with the Peace Pledge Union, although she never joined it. By the late 1930s, this did mean that she supported a position of absolute pacifism, and it's not difficult to understand how her critics very much felt that she'd become an apologist for the Nazis. As war broke out again in 1939, as I've said, she took her own life. She died days apart from another legendary suffrage figure, Charlotte Despard. But Charlotte Despard died at 95, whereas Swannack was 76. While most biographical studies take the cradle to the grave approach and come to grips with a life through the forward moving formation of character, ideas, and relationships, as I said, my approach is trying something different, and it's offering a grave to the cradle approach. A short but I promise brief indulgence here in intellectual autobiography I think will help elucidate why I'm doing this and how I've come to study Swannack in this way. Helena Swannack has appeared in different guises, and in many different guises, in my research over the years. She's a key actor, as we've seen in stories of the aftermath of suffrage. Her career is richly illustrative of the flowering of post-war careers and public service. She was a strong voice and led by example in mobilizing women for pacifist activism. And as such, she began to occupy a political space in close proximity to advocates of peace at any price on both right and left. She was instrumental in the feminization of international relations, and in practice, in theory, she contributed to the gendering of foreign policy. The way she lived her life, therefore, figured in all the areas of research that have piqued my curiosity over the years. And now, the way she ended her life and the timing of her death is very much part of a different story that I'm trying to uncover about a genus of war fear-triggered suicides that took place in 1938 and 1939. Indeed, her death by suicide was one of an apparent epidemic of suicides causally linked to the international crisis. So the questions that frame this investigation are these: how can we study a life from its ending, and especially from the cause of death, particularly when it's a self-inflicted death? Does the nature of her death demand that we conduct a psychological autopsy alongside a political retrospective and postmortem? Psychiatrists, of course, carry out psychological autopsies on suicides, and it should be possible for us to do something similar as the historian and as the biographer. So does an unnatural death define or redefine a life? That being said, I'm not entirely sure how to phrase this question, because what is slightly ironic here is that the coroner deemed her death a natural death, even though there were 2 suicide notes. So we can talk about that a little later, but I'm frustratingly not able to, haven't located those suicide notes yet. But they are reported in the coroner's in the newspaper coverage of these reports, and we can only assume that they are suicide notes that follow a kind of farewell to this world kind of format. Then there's this strange little piece of evidence that I came across as well, this strange little fact that she took in 2 little girls, evacuees, in 1939. And it does make us consider and think about the suddenness of her decision to take her own life. How, therefore, does Swannack's self-description as a controversialist guide her political action and her personal choices? I wonder if we'd see her life and her personality differently had she lived and died a natural death. Arguably, we can see her suicide as some sort of fulfillment of principle, while still acknowledging other contributing causative factors, like her mental despair and her physical pain. More broadly, I feel that this way of studying Swannack begs the question whether the fixation on the suffrage movement, and even more so on the militant tendency, obscures and obfuscates post-war, post-suffrage experience. All right, well, I'm not the first historian or international relations specialist to take an interest in Swannack. I think there are many people here who've encountered her in their own research. It's nonetheless worth mentioning that there is no biography. There's no full biography of Swannack. She has an autobiography published in 1935 called I Have Been Young, and it was published when she was a suitably ripe age. It's over 500 pages, and she generously details her life up to then. Indeed, the memoir is striking for its confessional mode in all things political as much as in things medical, and to some extent emotional. Her husband was a maths lecturer at the University of Manchester, and so they lived in Manchester for 12 years, where she suffered many illnesses due to the climate and the environment, which me and Matt can both attest to the reality of. As she put it, and again, Matt and I will empathize, she said, "It took me several years to recover from Manchester. And during that time, I did little except write for various papers and make a garden." She suffered a good deal throughout her adult life with health problems, digestive problems, which she described as intestinal rumpuses, which I feel, we wouldn't use that today, but it certainly captures something very special about her physical sensations. And she was a poor traveler. She had trouble sleeping. She had a travel illness, travel sickness. While she doesn't specify at any point in her memoir the cause of the couple's infertility, she regretted never being able to have children of her own. She put herself in the care of a female doctor and was operated on at the age of 58, after which some of her common complaints eased, some kind of digestive system operation. As she described it in 1928, the natural consequence, not so much of overwork, to which I was inured, but 2 years steadily increasing worry, was that in 1928 my health gave way. It was a long breakdown, beginning gradually, with persistent insomnia and sciatica, which became chronic, and I was incapacitated for continuous mental work till well on into the following year. And she goes on to this in this way. Now, it's interesting, as I say, how health matters, personal and bodily matters, and the aging process create an important sub-narrative of her memoir. Her book is full of meditations about health and death, about the dignity of dying, about the nature of old age. She makes a lot of allusions to mercy killing, to the fear of violent death by weapons of mass destruction. One can use the book as a reflection on death in a post-religious world. We can use it also to find clues for her own choice of death, that of suicide. We can look at it for meditations on generational time and a common trope of making way for the young. She certainly amplified the interwar discourse of the missing generation and the rule of a gerontocracy, which she much regretted, even if she herself admitted that she was very much part of that generation of geriatrics. Indeed, the conclusion of her memoir could have been the first draft, I would say, of her suicide note. And it reads as follows. I've had a happy life, much work, many friends. For 48 years, I had the friend of friends between whom, where there was no shadow. And she says, as I say, I'm just going to read the highlighted bit. You can read the rest on your own. I'm not afraid to die. I should be afraid not to die. So Swannack was 76 years old when she died, the victim of many physical illnesses, her psychic pain at the course of world events, and of the inevitable combined sexism and ageism that positioned and portrayed her as a spent force. In addition, it would be a tricky enterprise to write her biography for a number of reasons. She wasn't a party person, and I mean this in a political sense rather than one in entertainment. She was a temperamental liberal, but she worked much of her life with the Labour Party for convenience rather than out of conviction. Her personal papers are housed at Swarthmore College in the USA, and they're disappointingly slim in volume, which I can say after visiting them earlier this year. While embroiled in political controversy, her domestic life appears to have been relatively settled and undramatic, even somewhat prematurely middle-aged. But these points are not the only reason, or a good enough reason, for her not attracting the kind of attention and the volume of attention that many of her peers in the suffrage movement have done, and some of them led, I think, far less varied lives. I'm pleased to say that she is, however, represented as one of the 59 figures around the plinth of the Fawcett statue in Parliament Square. And when I was working with Gillian Waring, I definitely stressed the importance of her inclusion. But one of the most persuasive reasons, I think, for her life not having been spotlit is because so many of her achievements came after the First World War, came post-1918. Despite our best efforts over the past few years to illuminate what happened after the vote was won, this centenary year has only reinforced the fixation on the Edwardian suffrage movement. The way the suffrage centenary has unfolded and played itself out, precisely as a celebration or a series of celebrations, has inevitably led to a reductive and I think an even distorting reenactment of the sensations and feelings among suffrage campaigners at the passage of the Representation of the People's Act. Now, remember what Virginia Woolf had said about the passage of that act. For Swannack, it was similar. As she put it, the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, and on the 4th of December, the general election, 14th in fact, was held. It was the first election at which women had voted, and though, of course, I used my vote, it was with no hope and no rejoicing. Nor in the years after was she tempted to stand as a parliamentary candidate, although she was approached on a number of occasions. All right, so even in her own work, we have this sense of the anticlimax. I just have a few more pictures of her, but this is, I think, a good illustration of the anticlimax of suffrage, and that it was not some kind of new dawn. Swannack may not have received the full attention she deserves from historians, but in fact, her autobiography was well received, and amongst its admirers was none other than Virginia Woolf. Now, I wanted to see the two together for a moment, because I think there are some interesting parallels here. Indeed, it's worthwhile considering the correlation and causation between absolute pacifism and suicide. While there was a significant difference in degree in the temperature and the temperament of their pacifisms, Swannack and Woolf were deeply affected by the coming of war and the failure of peace. In both their bodies of work, there is a preoccupation with women's innate pacifism and the appointed role of women to prevent war. And we think here, of course, she was in correspondence with Woolf just after the publication of Woolf's The Three Guineas. Also in common, both are far more subtle and thoughtful about the intrinsic relationship between women and peace. Neither is satisfied with neat slogans conflating motherhood and peace-loving, and both are deeply frustrated by women, by their own sex, who support and even enable men to make war. They had in common, too, I think, that they were each married to men of intellect and achievement, but they were arguably the intellectually more powerful of the match. While a further similarity was that neither had experienced motherhood herself. So in this last section, does the tragedy and pathos of her death, of Swannack's death, does it make it more difficult to be critical about her life? And especially, I think, her more dubious political position in the latter part of the 1930s. Her friend, Irene Cooper Willis, wrote on the 27th of September, 1938, she said, "Peace at any price, peace with dishonor. I'm all for it, so long as we get peace." She was clearly aware when writing this that Swannack was like-minded. With peace unable to be preserved at any price, Swannack killed herself. There seems little doubt that she intended to take her own life, and it was widely known that her end was self-willed. Friends say that her heart was broken by the complete failure of her day and night campaign since 1914 to avert a new war, reported the Manchester City News. A letter written by Helena Maria Swannack, age 76, the authoress, was found dead in her bed at home in Maidenhead near London, indicated that she intended to commit suicide by using drugs, the coroner stated in an inquest at Maidenhead yesterday. A doctor said that there was no sign, I'll be there in a sec. A doctor said there was no sign of poison and that the post-mortem was consistent with a natural death, although he did not exclude the possibility of tablets being taken sometime before her death. He removed certain organs for analysis. Our sympathy is further aroused, I think, by the indignity of her body being subjected to forensic examination and the very public exposure of her insides, of her internal condition to the reading public. It was her local paper that offered the finest detail of the postmortem of the coroner's report. And as Dr. J.J. Patterson, who carried out the postmortem, said that externally the body was that of a stout elderly person. There was 2 surgical scars on the body, one apparently from the removal of an appendix. There was no indication or marks that would suggest death by violence or injury. Internally, he found the left lung adherent to the chest wall and somewhat shrunken. The heart was overladen with fat, as it would be from a valvular disease of long standing, and the left ventricle was full of blood, indicating failure of the pulmonary circulation. These signs would be consistent with death from narcotic poisoning. All the valves of the heart showed disease, and there were patches of arrhythmia at the root of the aorta and also in the coronary arteries. This would weaken the heart's action. The stomach and intestines were practically empty, and there was no residue found that could be identified in them. Now, I read that at length for effect, because I certainly read her life differently and from a different direction because of the insight provided by her death. And we feel for her in a much deeper way because of this. So I think finally, as a last point, it begs a wider question that is relevant to this workshop on post-war transitions. And that's whether we interpret these transitions and these transformations differently, even dramatically differently, depending on the direction from which we read them. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Julie, for your graveyard shift. As you said, I really liked your presentation, which is peppered with a sense of irony. I'm sure that presentation, which is wrapped around a biography of very interesting figure of Helena Swannack, will raise a
There's controversy. Swannack, I think.
Swannack, okay.
I've taken a long time to achieve that. So.
Okay, Swannack.
To be sure about it.
And I'm sure that this presentation actually aroused a lot of questions in you. So the floor is yours now. Please, Dagmar.
Thank you, Julie, for a superb paper, and we're certainly all awake now and was not a graveyard shift. I would like to follow up on this fact that Swannack, like many other suffragists and pacifists, was in a way eclipsed or marginalized and or didn't enter the chronicles, the official chronicles. And I was wondering whether you also see that within the context of the Women's International Congress in The Hague in 1915, who were literally called lunatics by Millicent Garrett Fawcett, and where there was sort of a brutalization of language also. I mean, Lila Costin writes about this, and that a lot of these women were literally written out of the official suffragist history later on by Millicent Garrett Fawcett and Ray Stracey. So how do you see that in relation to Swannack's sort of, in a way, eclipsed profile still in historiography?
Yeah, I mean, I think, thank you. That's a really interesting question. So I think, she has been eclipsed, but she hasn't been entirely excluded. I think she is well known because, again, of her very multi-dimensional career and contribution. But the problem is, I think, defining her because of that multi-dimensional contribution. She doesn't fit any one category, and she herself was kind of very, individual. She wasn't a group. She wasn't good in groups so much. She was, and she called herself. It was her own expression. I'm a controversialist. So she always wanted to go against the grain, and I think it just makes her harder to pin down. It makes her harder to write about. And she clearly wasn't intending to be memorialized and written about because of the nature of her archive, which is, as I say, really scant. So that also, I think, indicates to us that she didn't really want. She probably felt she had left the last word with her 509-page, autobiography. So she didn't. I think there was a modesty probably about her in not wanting to be the object of some kind of and probably a real sadness because of the real failures of all her campaigns, given that there was a Second World War now being waged. So I don't know if that answers your question to some extent, but yeah, I think, but then but 1915, these women have been rescued, and, with the centenary in 2015. So, there's still time for Swannack to get a second run and to get, to get in there on these commemorative processes. But because she falls between so many stools in terms of categorization, I think it makes her difficult to handle. And because I think there, as I've kind of said, I have some, a lot of people, a lot of women's historians really, look up to her and feel, only admiration for her, whereas I think that's, that last phase of her career makes her very difficult.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This was really very interesting, and I enjoyed it. Oh, sorry. I have a question that is somewhat connected. You said that her memoirs were well received. Mm-hmm. So I have a question about how was she generally perceived in her lifetime, mm-hmm. and as far as this apology for Hitler or Nazism, I would really like to know a little bit more about it, whether it is just a fact of pacifism or whether there were some other, perhaps ideological connections that she expressed about Nazi Germany.
Yes, thank you. Both really interesting questions. So her memoir was, why was it how was it received? In general?
How was she perceived as a public figure?
Yes, I mean, I think, I think that's another thing. She, I've looked at a lot of suicide stories. I mean, this was covered in national and local, in so many papers. So, her death was marked. She was seen as a public figure. So, she had made an impact politically. She had made a significant contribution to, international affairs. She was well known in her own right. So I think that that's a really good indication that she was, I wouldn't say a celebrity, but she was a well-known public figure. So she had clout in that way, but she was starting to ruffle more and more feathers as the 1930s, wore on, for the reasons that are, related to your next question. One of the people who she had a real scuffle with, in print at least, was, or who really took her to task, was Leonard Woolf. And Leonard Woolf wrote a scathing review of her book Collective Insecurity, saying that it was terribly naive and deeply dangerous, the way that she couldn't get away from her fixation that it was the Treaty of Versailles that had caused the Nazis, and that there was nothing we could do. So that she couldn't get off that note. She couldn't leave that. She couldn't forgive. There was nothing that she couldn't convince herself that it was the Allies who were responsible for the Nazis, and there was no way around that. So I think she was really stuck in that kind of loop, intellectually and strategically. But I mean, I think there was also the element that she was from a German family, that did probably play a part as well, and she did have a real sense of I think she had also been had to deal with her Germanness at various points in her life too.
Any other question? Are we all too tired?
It's truly the graveyard shift.
I had one question. It was connected to Hitler again. So actually, it was, I don't want to double it. I'm asking you again, encouraging you. Any other question?
So, no, I thought you might ask a different question, Andrea, because I was the suicide theme and the pacifism. I just wonder what one does with that. It's pretty depressing, isn't it? But with her, I don't see her as that marginalised because, and politically, yes, in a way, because she belongs to marginal groups. But the fact that she got chosen as a delegate to the League. Yeah. That she's, as a woman, editing foreign affairs for Democratic Union, And so someone who can kind of go across the gender divide, if you like, and be in the world of male politics as well as female politics. So that, but also, and of course then there's the controversial race sort of positioning. She writes those articles at the end of the First World War about the colonial soldiers in Europe and about race mixing. So she actually wants them out, not for pacifist reasons, but for, well, at least she used a racialist argument for why they shouldn't be there. So there's that part of her. And then there's the part of her that's sick, right? And just tired and old.
Yeah.
So do you want, I loved your paper. So now I'm just being a bit of a devil's advocate about, because earlier when we were talking about Zofka,
Kvider.
we decided, I call it Zofka, knowing her, Kvider, yeah. So there's a kind of history of depression, right? So once we start probing the personal, which I think is so important in all these histories, should we be more kind of all-encompassing in thinking about the relationship between the personal and the political, and just where the private intervenes? And it could be about, depression, psychological conditions. She's really into Freud, right?
Not particularly, no.
Well, in the biography, in the autobiography, there's like a lot about how everybody's interested in Freud. And, well, maybe she's just observing her time.
Right.
I thought there was a kind of interest in it. I don't know, were there earlier episodes of depression or anything? Or?
I think, as I say, she's really interested. I mean, she's really, as I say, the really important strand of that book is her health. And the way she suffers continually from her health problems and how they intrude into every decision that she can make. They completely curtail her political ambitions. Partially, it's her health or her husband's health. He predeceases her. He's older, but she's also in this strange carrying position. First, for her mother-in-law who is dying, and this is when she makes this point about the importance of the dignity of dying and makes a case for euthanasia. Then she has to talk about having nursed her husband through his illness and seen him die and had to deal with that bereavement. And then throughout that is all her own struggles with her own health. So I think there are very few women's autobiographies that concentrate so much and so openly, so kind of she really exposes herself. She exposes her body and her inner body in a way that I found really, really striking. She doesn't do it psychologically, though, so much. When reading the book, it's much more about her physical rather than her psychological state. But the kind of the relationship between the two is implied. I think.
Because you put it with Virginia Woolf, so obviously it's also the suicide rate.
Yeah, so but there's a lot of suicidality. There's a lot of talk about suicide among, and a few cases too of absolute pacifists who do talk about suicide or feel the need to, or feeling very suicidal, and I've got other evidence of that.
I'm just thinking about, really good projects. I'm thinking, Germaine style, right? So during the Napoleonic Wars, when she's really desperate politically, she's also very ill and she's insomniac. There's all these different things coming together. She writes a book on suicide because she's contemplating it. Right. And then the suicide book is also the argument about why she shouldn't do it, right?
Right, yes, yeah.
But, could we take a more general kind of look at it and say not so much pacifism but actual politics? There's something about the political woman who just gives up. Eventually, because it's just all
absolutely. She's out of steam, running out of steam. But as I say, she does foreground her own suicide decision throughout that memoir. So it's not something sudden. It's something very, very. It's very rationalized.
Is it a form of age, like a final assertion of agency?
Absolutely. But I didn't want this war, and I'm not going to live through it. I'm in enough pain, and that pain is is intellectual as well as physical. So, but then again, there's that strange detail that she takes in those evacuee children. So she's not, it must also be a spontaneous decision at some point, because why would she take on that responsibility? So she also clearly wants to mother finally as well. I think there's an element of that too. Yeah, maybe they're a pain in the neck, but or they're total brats. But yeah, absolutely a lot of. But I think, as I say, there's a staging. There's there are rehearsals for this final act, if you look for them. But that's what I'm saying. Because she does this, am I looking for the you conduct this psychological autopsy, which gives her a very different spin than Millicent Fawcett or anyone else we can think of who is similarly prominent, because the nature of her death changes the way we see her life. That's kind of my point. But she does fit into another category, and that's the bigger project. And she, as I say, she kind of braids together a number of strands of my research over the years. But there is this whole category. I've already found about 120 cases where of very much war-triggered, international crisis-triggered suicides, and not just thoughts of suicide. These are actually carried out. And in each case, the coroner, in one way or another, identifies the cause, the trigger being the crisis and the coming of war, fear of war. So she is part of a group in that sense, not intentionally necessarily, but she's clinically part of that kind of part of a certain phenomenon around these kind of suicides. And we can look at, there will be many other examples in all the European countries that we've covered today, but I'm focusing on the British example.
I got an impression that her idea about the dignity of dying is actually a chapter in human rights. Do you think so?
I think there is a correspondence there.
She would be a very actual. She would be very good in actual debates about euthanasia. Yes. Probably.
Yes, yeah, and as I say, I haven't looked entirely into her whole kind of political, all of her political campaigns. I'm not sure if how closely she fought that one, but she definitely speaks very favorably towards the dignity of dying, and she felt very strongly in that direction. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Just to ask something, do you have ever discussed her biography with a psychiatrist? Psychologists, do they did the interpretation in their way? Because I did my research doctorate and discussed it with, of course, clinical psychologists. Now I'm writing something about the soldiers from World War I, and I do that with psychiatrists. I'm social anthropologist, and I don't know to identify. So I just want to ask that.
Thank you. I mean, if you have someone who'd like to read it for me in that respect, I'd love that. It's hard to find someone who has that kind of, a psychiatrist who has that kind of time to read 509 pages of Helena Swannack. But if I found one, I would love it. A retired one, yes, indeed. But yes, it's for the project that where she is just a small element, and we had one of your colleagues was at that conference. I held a conference on suicide, society, and crisis, where we looked at all kinds of political suicides and suicides that are linked to crisis and politics. We did have practitioners, amongst us as well. But it's interesting how differently historians, sociologists, practitioners, charity workers, how differently we all kind of, on some level, how differently we approach the question of suicide, which was part of the purpose of bringing us together to realize how.
Totally different. I'm humanities, okay, but they have totally different interpretation, and I also in educational psychotherapy, so I saw that she was an ambivalent person through her life. She had lots of trauma, so who knows why she gets suicide.
So PTSD, yeah.
Who knows?
Yes,
so I won't be so sure that it's about politics, about family, who knows?
In this case, or in cases that you've studied?
No, in this case.
Oh, okay. Well, she wasn't actually in the war. She didn't serve during the war.
Okay. I'm not talking about that, but because I'm not researching a theme about suicide. But I won't be so sure that she did.
Well, you know
just
what?
like about.
I mean,
it was the reason.
Part of the part of the, you know, the solution to this mystery will be, if we manage to locate, I've got a research assistant hopefully going to see if we can actually locate those suicide notes, and they'll tell us a great deal. Now, she wrote two, because I believe one was to her doctor. One was, I assume, just, you know, I don't know, but it was, you know, again, it was saying that this is not just a natural death. I have made this choice. I have exercised my agency over my life. And the other one was to her doctor. So I guess she wanted to make sure that, I think she wanted to make sure that no one doubted that her death wasn't a suicide. Because she, you know, the medical, you know, in medical terms, this could have been a natural death. Right, well, yeah. Okay, thank you.